Hey everyone. Today I'm going to talk to you about why Johns are criminals, or as they are known in other parts of the world, punters or sex buyers. So men who utilize prostitution. Why the sex buying is violence. I know this is a very contested position, so I'm going to show you the arguments for it today. For those that don't know me, my name is Ali Arrow. I'm an activist in the field of violence against women with a focus on prostitution and have been for nearly 5 years now. And one of the ways I started engaging with the subject is because I took a closer look at these men, the men who pay for it. And I even made a whole website on the subject, focused on my country, Germany, where many of you will know prostitution is, to an extent, regulated and legal. And this presentation will also focus on Germany, but if you research in your own country, you will find a lot of these things are rather universal, though some are products of the specific German legislation. For those interested, I will of course put all my sources and my website down below. A little bit more background on me and the political movement I'm a part of. We call ourselves the Abolitionist movement because we're not just, somewhat critical of the sex trade. We think it needs to be abolished. We think that it stands in the way of equality, right, between men and women, and is a violation of human rights. And as you can see, this is a movement that's international, that is growing, and that keeps succeeding in many places. And the people who are part of this movement, right, the activists, a number of us have experienced the sex trade ourselves, right? Women who have survived prostitution or pornography or stripping. Many are social workers who have direct experience of working with women, right, and some men. Researchers and educators and just people from all of society. In Germany, we say, Freier sind Verbrecher, right? Johns are criminals. That's one slogan that we use. In the English-speaking world, people talk about end demand. And in the Spanish-speaking world, there's a lot of cool Spanish slogans. But for example, there's Putero, vamos a por ti. So, John, we're coming for you. And all of this, the purpose of all of this is to raise awareness that prostitution is not an act that a woman does by herself, alone in a hotel room, right? There's a man there. And he's not some passive consumer. So what we want to do, and I'll be completely upfront with you about our intentions, we want to reframe this debate, right? There's just an endless debate about the motives of the woman. Like, why is she there? What is she doing? Right? Is she an nymphomaniac? Is she a sexual weirdo? Is she all those things? We think this conversation is kind of a waste of time because statistically we know the vast majority of people in the sex trade, most of whom are women, which is why I'm going to generalize and say women, it's just sheer economic survival. And to me, solidarity with women in prostitution means that we don't do this whole division thing of those women, those are some poor victims, and those women are like evil temptresses or something, right? Or handmaidens of the patriarchy. I do not subscribe to that view. Because as an outsider, looking at the woman, I don't know what her reality is. But in my opinion, from what I do know about the system, no woman really comes out a winner. And I'll give evidence for all of this shortly. Instead, what we want to do is we want to focus on the Johns, on the buyers, who are a considerably larger group, right? There are many, many, many more buyers than there are women. In Germany, the estimates are that there's 1.2 million transactions within the sex trade every day, right? That's so roughly 1 million Johns every day. This industry makes 14.5 billion euros per year, right? So it's not a small industry at all. It's quite big. With an issue of this size, we should really ask ourselves, who are these men? Why are they doing this? And is this ethical? So who pays for prostitution? What kind of man does this? And again, I will generalize and say men. There are indeed women who do it, but there are so few that even my own government, who's not particularly feminist or anything, has said this is overwhelmingly men. This is a gendered phenomenon. That's how they put it as well. So from here on, I will just speak about men. Because I think in this context, gender-neutral language would be obfuscating power dynamics. Simple as that. Let's briefly look at how Johns are presented in media. Many times they're invisible, but if they do come up in film or TV, they're allowed to be the protagonist, right? Or as most of you will know in Pretty Woman, he can even be like savior, sort of white knight, actually, for her, who saves her from her sad little life, and who's, right, a love interest, or a true love even. Other times, right, purchasing sex is kind of a crude joke, and other times it's a sort of symbolic, like the lowest point a man has in his life. I'm thinking, for example, some of you may know, there's a famous German movie called The Lives of Others, and the main character goes through an ethical crisis, a crisis of conscience, and he's confused and lonely. So what does he do? He hires a woman to come and, to get his rocks off, and she's just a storytelling device to tell us, oh, he's down, he's lonely, he's desperate. So it makes him look a little bit pathetic, but we're still sympathizing with him. We're not really thinking about who's that woman and what is that situation like for her. She's just a symbol of his loneliness, and there's no further reflection of what just happened. And this whole Pretty Woman, romance, rich man, this kind of nice view on it makes it such that here I want to do a short excursion on the subject of luxury, prostitution, or luxury high-end escorting. So the average man who pays for this sort of high-end escorting, he is much more likely to look like this, right? A man with a lot of power, a lot of recklessness, and a potential for violence. Or he may look like this, right? This is Jack Nicholson. For those that are know, in 96, he hired a woman for $1,000, ordered her to his hotel room, and when she asked him to pay afterwards, he beat her, so she had to go to the hospital, and her eyesight was injured, and she was going blind. She almost went blind. This hasn't yet caught up with him in the Me Too era, but I think it should. Men who pay for prostitution can have a lot of different faces. This is another one. This is Seungri. He's a K-pop superstar. He was paying for women to stay at his parties and more, $4,800 per night. So that is the absolute high-end, top end of the sex industry. This is the zenith. 2018, he was arrested for participating in organized pimping and filming women while they were being raped. So this shows us that there isn't really a price class of prostitution. There isn't really some level of earning potential or something that you reach and then you're completely safe and you will definitely be respected. And I think the case of Seungri also gives us a very important hint towards what the whole point, what the core motivation of sex buying is, right? So we have a young, attractive, famous man who could have, I'm sure, found a woman who was interested in him on the basis of charisma or just, it's fine if you're just physically attracted to someone. Whatever. He could have had something to offer a sex partner other than just money. But that wasn't the point, right? Seungri used women as status symbols, more than that, as objects who just didn't matter, who were so worthless that whatever you wanted to do to them, however you wanted to prove to your guy friends what a great stud you were, you could do it. And now he was particularly brutal. And I'm not saying that every single sex buyer does this, though it's not incredibly uncommon that sex buyers will also film women and keep those films. Right? But not all of them are sadists. Of course, the story isn't that simple, but this sort of sexual egotism, this selfishness, is very strongly represented among Yeah, men who pay for prostitution. There are scientific studies on this, and there are interviews with men where they themselves will quite openly admit. So let's now turn from these famous men to some rather ordinary ones. These are 5 sex buyers from Germany. I have permission from the photographer who took these, Bettina Flittner. She gave me the permission to show them to you. So not stars, not politicians, these are normal men. There are various estimations. Sort of average one is that roughly every 5th German man regularly pays for prostitution. So a minority, but a big one. It really has to be clear to us that these men could be your boss, your colleague, your relative, your friends, could even be your partner. These are men of all ages, of all sectors of society, all social classes. About half of them are actually in a committed marriage or relationship. They're not single. And a lot of them actually like going to the brothel on their lunch break, right? So during work, because it gives them an automatic alibi. And there are not that many, very strong differences to be found between these guys and other men, but with the obvious exception that, right, they pay for it. And there is indications of increased porn consumption and sexual aggression. And this is confirmed by a study by the United Nations. And the United Nations are really not particularly critical of prostitution. So to me, that speaks quite strongly that even a study by the United Nations confirmed this. So the photographer of this photo series, Bettina Flittner, she also interviewed the men, and here's some things that they have to say about why they pay for sex. So Christian says, "A lot of women just stress me out. Paying for it has got something. That's power. You can do with her what you want." So this guy said to a female journalist, this is what he said. And it's not incredibly uncommon. There's quite a lot of scientific studies where similar phrases like that are said, right? It's about sex at the push of a button and sex where he is in control. He decides what happens. Whatever he wants to do, he can find someone who will do it. Kai says, "Usually I wouldn't get my hands on women like that. This is where I get to test her boundaries. Anal, for example, for 100 euros extra." This is very important because it already tells us a lot of Johns are fully aware that the desire isn't mutual, it's one-sided. He's attracted to her, right? But it isn't mutual. And secondly, this is where, let's say his girlfriend, his wife, his one-night stands have all said they're not interested in anal. But he can always find many women who do have to offer that to make rent. That's the simple reality. Prostitution allows him to do that, and worse, because he's got money and the woman in prostitution needs money. Joachim says, "You stop being content with normal women's bodies. My daughter is 26. The women have to be at least 27. But I see the pimps too." I'm going to address the subject of pimping later on again. Here I just want to say this already tells us prostitution doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? So it has ripple effects. He sees these women and he's kind of thinking about his daughter. So when he sees his daughter, is he thinking of those women? It can get muddy. He has to kind of put women into categories, right? The woman at home that he can't do certain things with, and the woman at the brothel where he can. Interestingly, in one study, buyers were asked how they'd feel if their own daughter was in prostitution. And only every 5th man said that they'd be fine with that. 4 out of 5 said no, that wouldn't be fine. So it's not for my daughter, it's for somebody else's daughter. Günther says, "I don't like them too professional. Those who only do it occasionally give you more for the price of 50 euros. That's where the price-service ratio is on point." This is a reoccurring thing, paradoxically. The buyer wants the woman to have fun, to enjoy it, or at least pretend that she does, because it'd be uncomfortable if she just kind of lay there doing nothing. But at the same time, he also views it as a transaction and himself as a customer. This whole thing is actually quite confused. There's a prostitution survivor from Germany. Her name is Victoria. She said, In what other occupation would you go to a hobbyist over a professional? If you were looking for a doctor, you wouldn't go to the person who does it in their free time. But a number of these men want a woman, right, it'll say in her ad that this is her hobby. Whether that's true or not, anyone can write that advert, it can say anything. But he wants the illusion that it's mutual, even though deep down he knows it's not, or many of the men know it's not. Ingo says, I'm too shy to chat up someone. 2 times I fell in love in the brothel. That's when you want to get her out of there. I'll never let that happen again. So he's kind of this pitiful man, or you could think him such. But actually, the man going to the brothel to look for love, that's another complicated issue in of itself. If you ask women, a lot of women who've experienced it about this so-called girlfriend experience, where he really feels like this isn't not just the illusion of a one-night stand, but actually of real intimacy. Many women will tell you that this specific men asking for this are actually incredibly invasive because, right, there isn't genuine affection. To them, affection is then just a performance. It's not something they do because they generally, they feel that it robs them of being able to do this authentically, or at least complicates it for them. It's different if you're just supposed to play horny or if you can dissociate, but if you have to be there and act as a girlfriend, even though you're not, it can really twist your head. And also importantly, Ingo says, right, when he has fallen in love, he no longer wants her to be there. Then he wants to save her. Then he wants to be her knight in shining armor. Then it is an abusive system that she needs to get out of. So you can see there's a lot of internal contradiction in many of these statements. There's a lot of awareness that something's wrong. There's also kind of nice, but then it's also kind of sad. It's all those things to these men at the same time. So now I want to talk to you about the daily practice of prostitution and explain why us abolitionists, why we use such words as, right, selling women or selling the body or buying a woman. You will sometimes hear those. I don't use them very often, but if you take a close look, you can see why anyone would use those terms. There's specific reasons. Now, it's absolutely correct that in standard prostitution, nobody is buying a woman to keep as his possession for however long he pleases, right? And there isn't even necessarily a pimp in the transaction, but it's a market. And many of us have complained about how much of the human experience gets commercialized. What you need to understand about prostitution is that the smallest detail of her body can become part of that commercialization and will be judged in comparison to what else is on offer. In practice, it looks like this. The sex buyer goes online. He has a gigantic choice of women, a gigantic range to choose from, and he gets to choose her. He has basically free choice. Only rarely will it happen that he actually gets rejected. And some women can't reject any man at all because they need money that desperately. He will always find somebody. In prostitution advertising, as well as in the forums where men rate women's performance, women are advertised and described like you might a meal at a restaurant or an Amazon product. What did she look like? In what state was she in when she was delivered to his door? Did she do what he wanted from her? So this includes discussions of how old was she? What was her race? What was her hair color? How tall is she? What's her face like? How pretty? What's the state of her teeth? How large are her breasts? What is her weight? How tight and big is her butt? How tight is her vagina? And is she hairless down there? Now, there tends to be a preference, not exclusively, but it's a tendency that, right, the body sought out should be female, young, and a number of men like women inexperienced. And then there are specific fetishes that a number of men have. Some are incredibly fetishistic towards trans people. There are men who want women who are visibly pregnant, some of them quite far along in their pregnancy. There are those seeking drug-addicted women, and to be clear, that's legal in Germany. All of that's legal in Germany. Homeless women, just someone who looks broken and in a desolate state. So I think this already kind of calls into question the whole framing of prostitution as a service. Hushkama, who's a prostitution survivor, explains it like this. She says, like, if you're looking for, let's say, a really great blowjob, why not get it from an older guy, like a grandpa? Maybe he's really good at it. Let's say he's excellent at blowjobs. Why not him? Or why not an older woman? Someone who's skillful. But no, that's not the case. The preference is definitely for younger women, right? Somewhere between 20 and 30. Some men like younger, and some men do like older, but it tends to be between that 20 and 30 range. Why is that? If it's about skill and her body, doesn't matter. What's the obsession with, like I said, age, race, etc.? In prostitution, the state her body is in is absolutely central. It's a huge topic of discussion all the time, and that's why we talk about the sale or the renting of women's bodies. Now, how does the journey of the sex buyer continue after he has made his choice? I am going to describe to you a very, very average interaction in a brothel based on hundreds of entries into forums. Not horror stories, but everyday, totally normal acts, just to make everything less abstract. And this is based on about 2 decades of different evidence from sex buyers themselves and their forums. Firstly, the sex buyer tells the woman what he wants from her and pays an average of 50 to 60 euros for 45 minutes. There are often problems during this negotiation when she speaks little or no German. A cinema or dinner before is very rare. Second, she gives him a blowjob or a handjob until his penis is erect. Foreplay for her is not standard and usually costs extra. That in of itself tells us this is about his pleasure and hers is an afterthought at best. Then he penetrates her in various positions until he orgasms. When he has finished or the time has run out, it's over. That's it. That's the prostitution act. That's the average thing. But now, in addition to that, you'll have to understand that this happens multiple times a day for many women. Now, there may be a day when there's not many customers, and that's a problem too, right? Because she needs money. But when there are, many of these women have 5 men a day, 10, 15, 20. She will have to have a minimum amount of like 3 or 4 a day at least to cover her the expense of paying for the brothel room, which is quite high priced in Germany. And a lot of these sex buyers know that it's kind of running like a factory. There's a guy before him and a guy after him. It's talked about all the time. It's completely normal. And many of them it doesn't particularly bother. Like they don't care if they're one of dozens and dozens and dozens of men she's seen this week. But you can see this is kind of, in my opinion, capitalism on steroids. And it's extreme commercialization of sexuality. So sex is something that you consume, and it's kind of like fast food. So it's fast sex, half an hour, often, sometimes just 20 minutes. And it's not really surprising that in all of this, you get these descriptions of women as acting out of routine, being robot-like, lacking enthusiasm, sometimes being compared to dolls or even to corpses. And this again affects the next part of all of this, which is the review. A minority of men will actually write a review, not all of them will bother. This minority provides the reports for the other men. There's a huge number of men who do read them, even if they don't write them themselves, who use this information, who find this relevant. So again, right, her appearance, her actions, the degree of her boundaries, and of her enthusiasm. often with a grade or, 1 to 5 stars at the end. And then a recommendation to the other buyers, whether that's a, bitchy one or a ripoff. German sex buyers have coined the term rip-off cunt that they like using for women. There's also very racist terms used for women of color. They will call Sinti and Roma women gypsies, and they will also use the N-word. These forums, right, are an instrument for these men to exchange this kind of information, to seek out vulnerable women, and to force women out of business who have displeased too many of them. It's a tool of power. But essentially, again, I'm not trying to convey to you that this is some weird misogynistic subculture of fast sex, but that this is in fact violence. Why do abolitionists say that this is violence? I think it's completely fair. If you're not convinced yet, I will carry on and try to lay it out. Now, looking at prostitution from a bird's eye view, right? We want to do a system analysis, not an individual one. And also, you might hear this word thrown around all the time, intersectional. I'm telling you, prostitution is the very subject where intersectionality can be something meaningful, right? Who has the structural power? Who, on average, in this interaction between the man and the woman, is going to be the one making the decisions and calling the shots? He's usually older than her. She's younger. He is a local, and she's often an immigrant or even a refugee. Now, this will be a little bit different in places with sex tourism. She'll be the local, but he'll be the sex tourist with money, and she'll be the woman with substandard living conditions. He's had more access to education. She's been neglected in these terms. Right? He has access money. She's lacking money. He is likely integrated into the community that he comes from, and she will often be socially isolated, right? Due to being foreign and being poor and also being absolutely stigmatized by society. And as we've heard, sex buyers are above average on sexual aggression, and it's not prejudice. There is scientific evidence that women in prostitution on average are more likely than other women to have previous trauma, especially sexual trauma. So not every single woman in the trade will meet, like, all of these things will apply to her, right? Not every single woman is just a definitive victim. That's not the point. To understand that still, overall, this is a system of male power. And this inequality leads us to the next point, which is discussing what consent means. Consent is another one of these words. We hear it all the time. But what does it actually mean, and how can we meaningfully apply it to a situation as highly contested as prostitution, right? We hear adult consensual sex that is paid. But is it in practice? Now, what I have on screen here is a graphic from Planned Parenthood. I know it's a little bit playful, right? Consent is as easy as fries, freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, specific. Despite the playfulness, I think this is really good to analyze prostitution again. What happens when we apply this definition of consent? 1, freely given means there are no significant consequences to any party who wishes to say no. What do we have in prostitution? Very often, she can't say no for purely financial reasons, as well as the threat of retribution from the buyer or a pimp. 2, reversible, meaning no significant consequences if one party decides this was enough, I don't like it anymore, or I want to take a break. What do we have in prostitution? She's not very often realistically in a position to change her mind, for the reasons I just named, as well as the fact that many sex buyers feel once they have paid, they are definitively owed sexual access to her. So it's very common that there will be fights for every minute that he thinks she stole from him and this kind of stuff. Every respectful person would stop if their partner said, I don't want to anymore, I'm not feeling like it, I'm not comfortable. But many sex buyers will fight. Why? Because they've invested money. Third, informed. Ideally, right, and I understand that this will exclude people who have not had access to this kind of education. But still, generally, you would hope that you both have reasonable understanding of like why protections is important, right? And you can be open about medical questions, such as, right, asking your partner, have you done an AIDS test? It should be, I mean, this is in the context of a progressive open society, hoping that it's okay to say that to a person. Ideally, it is. What's the reality of prostitution? A lot of women, especially in Germany, who are poor immigrants from Eastern Europe, they have had very little or no sex education. And this will be exploited all the time, right? They'll be told by pimps or by buyers that this or that, it can't get them pregnant, or doing this or that will prevent them from getting AIDS, etc. And there's quite a number of men who will refuse to use condoms, and they're playing roulette with their own lives and with hers. 4, enthusiastic, right? Both parties should enjoy sex. I don't know why this is controversial. For some reason, I experience discussing this with people repeatedly, as someone says. Now it's actually quite... You're being weird saying that it always needs to be fun for both people. And I know that we live in a society where, sadly, the reality is that a number of women, or I guess some men even, have made the experience that sex is not enjoyable, and that sucks. But let me tell you, it should be. And anyone who told you that you should just kind of get it over with and endure it, they're an asshole or even an abuser. Now, in prostitution, we know that it's not about her enjoyment, right? Otherwise, we would have foreplay as a standard thing for her. But her arousal is irrelevant to a lot of men. And in fact, they'll have to pay extra if they want to perform oral on her. Which is odd, because don't we see these news articles all the time about how women love oral sex? So if it was something that she greatly enjoyed, what's happening where that is monetized? And what you need to understand is that every time he pays extra, it's because it's something extra that she doesn't enjoy. So for the average woman, best case scenario is it's kind of experienced as boring. And but in many cases, this sex that you're having that you don't want, there's no mutual attraction, it's not fun, that's in fact traumatizing. Finally, specific, both people have the option to express what practices they want to do and which ones they don't want to do, etc. And now you might think, oh, but there's this negotiation phase in prostitution, that's all very clear. But again, this can only happen if such detailed communication is even possible, which it isn't with the common language barrier between the German John and the Eastern European woman. So not all sex that doesn't meet these standards is immediately rape, but you get closer to rape every time an aspect here is shaky, or several ones aren't present. And if you look on these John forums, you'll quite often find acts that are quite obviously violence. You don't even need to do this detailed analysis. We have sex buyers meeting women who they say they're not sure if they're adult, who are clearly not enjoying themselves, who are clearly apathetic, drunk, or high, or obviously victims of trafficking. In the best case, a sex buyer in this scenario will refrain from paying to access her and will go look for another woman. But there's quite a number who frankly don't care. Some of them even know the pimp on a first-name basis, and the pimp is there for him to complain to when there is trouble for him. In the most serious of cases, sex buyers in Germany will participate in the so-called breaking in of women. This is when a woman is raped to the point that she will no longer fight back. It's the breaking of her boundaries. And this is the category that you would rightfully classify as, both rapist and sadist. But you also have to ask yourself the question of why this breaking in is happening. And my answer would be because there is another group, this group that doesn't want to see reluctance, that doesn't want to see her disgust, that doesn't want to see her putting up boundaries, who just wants to see her going along with everything, possibly with a fake smile. She's broken in for that group. So not the sadists, the others that you might have labeled sort of nice. And now, again, I have a header here saying violence under legalization because I'm saying very specifically, all the things I'm describing to you are not happening in some run-down illegal brothel somewhere where everything is hush-hush secret. This is happening behind the front of legal brothels and escort agencies in Germany. And it was a very important sort of wake-up moment for me when I realized these guys are so incredibly just not scared of consequences. Only in cases of someone being a minor do I read a man being kind of like, oof, I'm worried about something happening. I'm being caught and punished. Because that's explicitly illegal. But all this other stuff I mentioned, they're kind of like, it happens. I'm not responsible. Exemplified by the statement of this man who says, if I ask a sex service provider about her price, I can't tell whether she's being forced. Her private life is none of my concern. With a purchasable woman, I only speak about what I would like from her and what I think it's worth in terms of money, not like she cares what I endured to earn it. Right? He sees himself as the customer, and the customer isn't responsible for how the product or the service provider arrives in front of him. And many studies and interviews confirm this. Again, prostitution survivor Hushka Mao says that every sex buyer, all of them, from the sadist to the one who wants girlfriend experience, every single one of them is taking a considerable risk that in the moment that he's paying for it, the woman he is touching or penetrating doesn't want him doing those things. And that's why we think sex buying is violence. In addition to this unwanted sexual contact, there is also more violence that is frequently perpetrated by buyers. And I know that at this point in the presentation, we are already at a very dark point. Given this presentation, I can feel it myself. I'm like, this is already dark stuff. Do we really need to go further than that? I think we do. Because this is not the odd experience, it's in fact an everyday fear women have. This is a pamphlet by a pro-prostitution organization, right? Advice on how to deal with punters when doing sex work. And it exemplifies quite, strongly in their visuals. This is given to women in Italian street prostitution. That violence at the hands of the sex buyer is a daily fear of many women. And statistically, confirmed by the German government, sex buyers are the biggest group of violent perpetrators against women in prostitution. Unfortunately, a lot of media will report about these cases as sort of isolated incidents, and there's not really any context analysis. But it's a pattern. It's a statistical truth. Which leads me to this, the murders of women in prostitution. Since 2002 in Germany, we've had at least 91 murders and 57 murder attempts. There are no official statistics. This is all by activists, some of them survivors themselves, who's done this research. This is just what media has been reporting. Women from all areas of prostitution can be murdered, literally from the streets to high-end escort. Because the murder doesn't go, hey, you, do you really like sex work? Oh, you do? Okay, I will look for a different victim. And their motives are very strongly related to, this view of entitlement. I paid, I can deal with this woman whatever I want. If she speaks back, she's gonna get what's coming to her. A lot of women are being attacked because they're refusing to do specific practices, for example, anal sex. And again, the perpetrator will kill in a situation of so-called escalated price negotiations. Now, no money in the world would be an acceptable reason to murder someone. But you have women here being murdered by Johns for 10, 20 euros. some of them dying, others being, murder attempt, leaves you traumatized for life and possibly injured. Some women end up paralyzed. These, again, not isolated cases like the pamphlet I showed you before. Women fear this all the time. Violence, and in the extreme cases, murder at the hands of your own customer or boss, is part of the reality of prostitution, even when it's legal. And in my opinion, laws can never fully protect you from this, because it is de facto dangerous to go to the home of a male stranger, to get into his car, or to let him come into the room. Especially a stranger who is strongly convinced that he has the right to sex on the push of the button and have it exactly in the manner that he's expecting. And I really do not want this misconstrued at me saying that any of this is her fault, right? I'm just trying to tell you what's happening, the reality of the situation and the risks. Of course, the blame is always exclusively on the perpetrator. Finally, I want to talk about the German law's perspective. Now, after all that we've heard, it might seem a little absurd, but in Germany, prostitution is considered a job and a service and a business, and the man's customer, and she's a service provider, and all those things. We've had this cemented in law. Prostitution has been legal much longer, but we have it cemented in law since 2002. The goal was very commendable. It sought to destigmatize women and to allow them entry into ordinary society. But the only thing that really became more socially acceptable was paying for it. Women in prostitution is still incredibly stigmatized. No woman here can write on her resume, I spent 5 years at a brothel. Absolutely impossible. In the view of the law, the buyer is a customer getting a service, and at the very least, it acknowledges that he's not quite like every other customer, because he can technically sue for getting a bad service. This is where they realize how much power potential men have in this situation, and they don't want to give them that tool. Unfortunately, we know of at least one case where a man did succeed and say that a woman frauded him for not giving him an orgasm. And it's crazy. Just crazy that that can happen. Until 2017, it was completely legal to pay for sex without a condom, to pay to access pregnant women, to purchase a gangbang, so one woman and many men, and much more than that. Until July 2017, it was in fact legal to pay to, in my opinion, rape a person who was trafficked. Because again, the customer cannot know how the service provider ended up in front of him. And this whole mentality is also now affecting everything during the corona pandemic, because we have just returned from this model to widespread prohibition. That's how fast things change. During corona, the sex buyer is in violation of social distancing rules, but the woman, she's illegally working, and thus in most places in Germany, she is punished more heavily than he is, which can mean fines in the 4 digits, and if she's a repeat offender, prison. Even though it should be completely clear that any woman in prostitution right now during corona is doing so for absolute desperation. What do sex buyers say about what's going on? They're saying things like, I'm taking a break, but now would be the opportunity to lower prices permanently. Right? So some of these guys do care about their health. They're not doing it right now, but they can see the potential. Women are desperate. They're criminalized. They have far too little support. This can be an extra power grab for the sex buyer. The second guy says, you never want to be as anonymous as when you're having pay sex. No one is giving their real contact data. So for a time we had brothels reopen, and they were like, oh, just let the guys, right, you just scared. Everyone wears masks, and no kissing, please, and just massages. And every single one of these rules broken, and key, of course, Men were admitting left and right that they were leaving fake contact data, so that, again, endangering everyone, themselves, their partners, their housemates, and of course the woman in prostitution. And in Switzerland, we did have a outbreak at a brothel. But there could have been more, and we simply don't know, because this industry by nature is hush-hush. Women have a quota to meet for a pimp, or because they need the money to make ends meet. And the people with the choice, the buyers, are deciding to do this kind of stuff. The next guy says, lots of whores need the money or they're being forced. The fucking continues. So sex buyers, a lot of sex buyers abusing the current situation, and what are we doing? We're punishing women. Right? Leaves you speechless. We desperately have to change this and acknowledge that, like, women are not evil, greedy, illegal workers, or like they want to break the law or something. It's desperation that's making them do this, or force. Finally, lastly, after all this darkness and horrible stuff, here's a slight bit of hope. A lot of you will heard about the sex buyer law or the Nordic model. I know it's very contested, and we can talk about the details of it another time. But this is the model where the person in prostitution is decriminalized, but the man who pays is not. And this is already the law in 8 different countries. Now, this model does not solve all problems overnight, and it's actually incredibly complicated to implement, but I think it's a step in the right direction. Certainly for Germany, who I do not believe would benefit from heavy additional regulation or eliminating regulation. Both of those would have disastrous consequences, in my opinion. Now, as I said, sex buyers in Germany currently experience nearly no consequences of their behavior, right? This whole idea that you just legalize it fully, and then every woman who's hurt in any way will take a man to court, and that's how you're going to lower the violence because women have rights now. It doesn't work. It's hard enough for women outside of prostitution to take a rapist to court. Women in prostitution have all these extra barriers, like I said, socially isolated, don't speak the language, etc. It doesn't work. But whose behavior you can change, and actually with quite low-level measures, in my opinion, is the sex buyer. Now, in Germany, we're not likely to do this whole thing of outing someone publicly. I think that's comes from the American protest context. That's not even possible here. And I don't know if that would be right? Because he'd be outing that man, and maybe he has a wife and children who might be affected by him being outed, and that's not fair to them. But what's more usually done is just fining him, and optimally that's adjusted to his income, and optimally that money is then funneled to pay for support and exiting service for women. But if he's a repeat offender, he can face prison. And right, if men are asked themselves a lot of those things, they say they would stop. It's not like they have this insatiable urge they could never possibly overcome. If there are consequences, if society says, no, you do this, we'll take away your car, we'll send a letter home, which might be opened by your spouse, we will not tolerate this. If you keep doing this, you will actually be in prison because you are committing an act of violence. Then men themselves are saying, oh, well, I mean, if there were these consequences, I wouldn't be doing this. I don't think men are born to do this. I think that society permits them to do so. And that if we do take it seriously to communicate to boys and young men that this is not harmless, this is not cool, but it lacks respect, and it is a form of violence, that more of them will choose not to do it. So finally, we have my favorite sex buyer quote. It's a very short one. He just says, it's just a matter of time until we get Swedish laws over here. If it comes to that, I will quit the punting life. Welcome back, my hand. So, right, every man has got a hand in times of desperate need. Really, nobody has to purchase access to other people's bodies. My vision of an equal society doesn't include sex buying, but includes one where no woman, no immigrant, no poor person has to do this. And we have enough to cover everybody. And in my view, the power dynamics of prostitution, the ones it springs from, are also those that it cements. Because women don't come out of prostitution with tons of money saved. They go in poor and they stay poor. I think it exacerbates misogyny and racism. and poverty, and thus stands in the way of us solving those structural inequalities. And that movement, who thinks like I do, well, we're the abolitionists. So thank you for listening.